topics. He's the director of the Center for Transportation Public-Private Partnership Policy, and that will be the subject of this talk. His undergrad is from Carnegie Mellon and a master's and PhD from Berkeley, so familiar territory there. And he's now the associate dean of something. I don't know why. Oh, okay. Liberated. So that gives him time to do his sabbatical, which he is, and finish papers, etc. So I'm delighted to find that he's not only a very smart and an intelligent, rigorous person, but he's very applicable and has a good sense of humor. So I'm sure you're all going to enjoy. Thank you very much for coming. This is his first time to join the tech.
Yeah.
Oh, and the lunches are on their way.
Okay. Is that sound working or? Uh-oh. Okay. Someone will hopefully. So I'm delighted to be here, and let's see. Is that? So I'm going to try to talk for maybe 20 minutes or something, but I'm happy to have questions as I go, so I don't have to get through all my slides. So don't feel like you have to let it in. So anything that comes up, I want to talk about public-private partnership policy. We're doing some work in that area at George Mason, and we have just created a center. We've had a grant from our Secretary of Transportation for the last year and a half, and so we're well into the work. So Windows machine, I think I can do that. So so I didn't know what the audience level of knowledge about transportation finance was. So public-private partnerships, probably known to most people. Okay, good. Highway trust funds. Okay, good. So gas tax. Good. All right. So I was going to say if it was a lot of undergraduates, iOS 7, and then every hand in the room would go up. But anyway, we got a good. So I'll sort of zoom through the finance stuff and then focus on the P3 stuff and some of the experience we've had with that in Virginia, and then some of the research and activities we're doing at the center. So you probably know U.S. is not a big investor in infrastructure. This is OECD countries, so the developed countries, the red arrow is the U.S. You can see that we're down. This is about 1.5% of GDP in transportation and communication infrastructure. I think it's pretty widely agreed that we don't invest that much, or as much as many other countries. That could be because we invest better, or it could be because we don't invest enough, or it could be some combination of the two. But we've had a history of fairly low investment. Funding sources, I think this is known to most folks in the room. Federal gas tax, 18.3 cents per gallon, not indexed to inflation. I think this is right, according to my students, at 29.1 cents per gallon. Here in Georgia, state tax. Virginia has just abolished its cents per gallon gas tax this year. First state to do that, and shifted to a sales tax on wholesale gasoline and diesel, and a $64 alternative fuel vehicle fee, which is probably the most controversial part of the package, that you would charge electric vehicles a fee. Registration and tolls come through. Non-user fees growing for the last 2 decades as a source of funding, so a lot of sales taxes, Virginia's included, but a lot of local option, state sales taxes. Virginia raised its state tax from 5 to 5.3, and that 0.3 goes into the Virginia Transportation Fund. A lot of debt financing, transportation very active in the debt and capital markets, and so a lot of participation there, different flavors of bonds, and TIFIA, federal program, just bumped up to $2 billion a year as a loan and credit support program that can be given to projects, state infrastructure banks. We have one in Virginia. I'm not sure there. I think is one in Georgia or no. I'm not positive. Or private loans. So funding crisis, old news to this crowd. Probably that right-hand side of the screen is the Highway Trust Fund anticipated balance and the reasons why that's happening. Purchasing power that I mentioned, aging infrastructure, increasing demands for maintenance and renewal, fuel efficiency, electric vehicles, and so forth, and a political inability or unwillingness to raise the gas tax. And so that really has put a cap pretty much on federal funding. The folks at AASHTO, Jack Basso, who was the chief financial guy at AASHTO for many years, said, I never thought, in the last round of reauthorization that we would be hoping to hold steady. That was our goal, was just level funding. So not even trying to get an increase, just hoping to hang on to what we've got. So increasingly states are looking to public-private partnerships, P3s, as a source of funding. It's a long-term contract between a private consortium, usually a special purpose organization of some sort, and a state. It often involves bundling of project delivery phases, so design, build, operate, maintain, design, build, operate, maintain, finance, various stages, claims, some evidence to support them that you get more efficiency in that bundling process by bundling those together and shifting risk to the private parties for some of the risks that are in a project. We'll talk a little bit more about that later because some of those risks have come to bear, and there have been some big private losses, and some of the private willingness to bear those risks has, the enthusiasm for that risk has diminished, and so that's changing the P3 landscape that we are facing today in 2013. The advantages I mentioned, access to private capital is probably the one that motivates the U.S. most, U.S. agencies the most. P3s have been used around the world for a long time, but in the U.S., we don't have much of a history of it because we've had a strong federal state funding mechanism, particularly in surface and highway transportation. On budget, on time delivery incentives in the design, build, operate, maintain model. Claims, I say, of cost savings, and I think there's some evidence to support that. But they are expensive. The transaction costs of entering into a P3 in terms of consultants, underwriting firms, and so forth are quite high. The concern by some stakeholder groups, including the Southern Environmental Law Center, has been very concerned about the fact that this circumvents or short circuits the capital planning processes that over the last 50 years have been put in place to bring stakeholder groups into the project selection process. And if you suddenly short circuit that by letting somebody buy their way to the front of the line, that raises concern. And the projects are complex, and that has been, I think, a concern to some of the departments of transportation and officials who are a little bit worried about entering into a kind of complex transaction with which they have very little experience. We've been doing design build, or we've been doing design bid build for 75 years. We know how that system works. Design build was a big jump. Moving to these more complex arrangements, it raises some issues. Here are the states that have P3s as of March of this year. Georgia's in the mix, as you see, as is Virginia. Pretty widespread. Some of the big empty states out west are the ones that are white on this screen because they don't really have the native demand that necessarily will support it. Some of them also don't have a political culture or constituency to support it. Puerto Rico's on the list, although they're in terrible financial shape right now. They've been big players in the municipal bond market because nobody has to, their bonds are tax-free, state and federal, but they have very high debt ratios now and have had a lot of trouble in the last year to 18 months. Virginia, Florida, Texas have been pretty aggressive in P3s. Texas has had the leash pulled back by the legislature. There was a Trans-Texas Corridor, some very ambitious projects to build things in Texas, and that's been pulled back. Virginia is, I'll talk a little bit about an existing lawsuit that is raising a lot of interest around the country on the legitimacy of the tolls that support P3s in Virginia. Florida has just expanded its bill to be not only transportation, but all civil infrastructure, so prisons, schools, office buildings, and so forth, and they're just on the verge of rolling that out. They've had a strong transportation P3 environment, or tradition, but now they've expanded that statewide. And some surprising states, in my mind, Maryland, Pennsylvania, both recently enacted P3 legislation. We'll see if they're able to follow through with it. And some strong labor states, and labor has been a concerned constituency about P3s, have begun to, I think, step forward and take on P3s because they see it's not a question of P3 versus public finance, but a question of P3 or nothing. And in that trade-off, the construction trade unions, anyway, are willing to say, yes, we'll go for P3s because otherwise we don't get the projects at all. And Ulico, which is a union labor something insurance company, actually has created a P3 fund and is beginning to invest in projects in Illinois and other places around the country. So let me just pause there. As I say, I invite interruptions, so Hans, nothing too difficult.
Yeah,
sir,
so the attraction, part of it is there's private money invests, and private money gets a revenue source back out. So then that revenue source is they can put tolls on their private road because it's their private road. In a way, the public sector, for perhaps political reasons, couldn't put a toll on a road because everyone would be up in arms about taxes.
either putting a toll or raising a toll. I think, I don't know the details of the Georgia experience, but there's this I-70, where the state was going to go to a P3 and the private concessionaire would have control over the toll levels, and the governor then pulled that back in January of this year, I think I read, just say the state will retain the authority on the toll levels because they did not want to have that in the control of a non-governmental party. And that's been one of the big stumbling blocks for P3s, I think, politically, is to say, are you going to turn over jurisdiction to toll setting authority to a non-governmental entity that isn't accountable to the voters? And but yes, to circle back to your question, the idea, in the simplest case, is you have the Chicago Skyway, you sell it to a concessionaire, Macquarie, for $1.6 billion. The city of Chicago takes the $1.6 billion. Macquarie says, okay, we're going to take this road, which happily has recently been upgraded, and we're going to raise the tolls and begin to collect the revenue for 99 years. I mean, 99 years is a very, very long concession agreement. If you think back to where you were 99 years ago, in 1914, I mean, this is pre-World War I. I mean, it's a lot can happen in 99 years. So these are really long agreements. But I mentioned with some of the big losses we've seen recently, the willingness, the appetite to take revenue risk, I think, has been reduced on many of the concessionaires, and so that market is changing, and many states are turning to an availability payment model, AP model, where the state pays the concessionaire for making the facility available. And so you can then raise the question, well, what's the private risk in this? And it's really in the design, build, maintain, operate side, and a guaranteed availability payment going out. So they're working to the payment as opposed to toll revenue. Because if the economy tanks or something, that's not something the concessionaire can really control. And so if you're going to give them, if they're going to take that risk, they're going to want a premium on their return for doing that. So, sir.
What's the risk in having a private entity responsible for maintaining a piece of infrastructure that's critical for a regional or national economy? You know, if they feel that they can't make a profit on it, would they allow maintenance on it to last? And therefore, the state loses this piece that's important to them.
Good question. Typically, The concession agreements, which are, you can imagine, jawbreaker documents, have written into them performance standards for pavement quality, for incident clearance, for snow and ice treatment, and they, there is an important part of the governance of P3s is the ability to police and ensure that those standards are being adhered to, and that has to be built into the agreement, and the state, the governmental body, has to have the wherewithal to be able to do that, and to default out failures, and where you can default the contract, either penalize them, withhold an availability payment, intervene in some way and say you're defaulting on the obligations that you have, and ultimately forfeit your right to your concession. So there are hooks in there. Writing an airtight agreement is, if you're familiar with the idea of incomplete contracts, the theory, Coase just passed away a few weeks ago, who had the idea that no contract is complete. And I told some of these P3 guys at a recent meeting about the theory of incomplete contracts, and they said, oh, I don't think so. I mean, we think our contracts are extremely complete. But you don't, there are a lot of things you can't write a complete contract, was Coase's point. And so at some point you may choose to internalize and self-supply as opposed to contracting or entering into a market-based agreement. So there may be ways to get out of that performance specification, but I think that's one that's probably pretty well established. So, other questions? Okay, so Georgia, I guess I'm not that familiar with it, so I invite corrections or amendments here, but legislation in 2003 that allowed unsolicited proposals, and that unsolicited is an important feature of these P3 laws. Do you permit unsolicited proposals, or do you only allow proposals where the government goes out and solicits proposals, or writes a request for qualifications or a request for interest? And the reason that's important is that question of integrating with the statewide plans and the planning and capital planning and programming process. If you allow unsolicited proposals, does that mean you get to jump to the head of the line in terms of environmental approvals and planning approvals and so forth? What if the priorities of the private sector are not the same as those for the governmental bodies? Who sets the priorities? Are they set through our traditional planning process, or do we now have a different factor? So Georgia started with an unsolicited proposal provision. It was taken away in 2009. Only solicited proposals being allowed in 2009. Ongoing projects here, the ones we found, and with these recent changes in the toll setting authority in January, to pull that back from a sort of a full-blown P3 to retain the toll setting authority at the governmental level. I mentioned early deals, which got a lot of headlines. Chicago was $1.6 billion, 99-year concession. Indiana was $3.8 billion, 75-year concession. I mean, that's a lot of money. And in the Chicago case, it went right towards pension liabilities. I mean, it didn't go into transportation at all. In the Indiana case, the money was put into a transportation trust, and then projects throughout the state. Indiana Toll Road sort of goes east to west across the state. So the idea, of course, the ideal toll road is one where tolls are paid only by people from outside your state who don't vote in your state. So Indiana's a pretty good setup because it's a bridge state. There's a lot of east-west traffic that goes across Indiana. So, but we've had some big failures. As I mentioned, South Bay Expressway was a project south of San Diego. Had a TIFIA loan that had a lot of private money in it. They came on board in 2008, not such a good time to come on, with a road that had toll demand coming from housing developments in the South San Diego area. Well, it just didn't happen. And so they, whether they defaulted, that's a legal term, whether they actually defaulted is somewhat in contention, but anyway, they failed. And eventually, just recently, that roadway is now being operated by SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments. And so, I mean, one of the arguments that P3 proponents will make is, look, even if it fails, you have a very nice road there that reverts to the public owner. And, you know, the private guys might lose their shirts, but, you know, that's their risk. If they took the risk, they gambled and they lost. Well, in South Bay, they lost, and hundreds of millions of dollars. And so the, you know, the TIFIA, which had money in South Bay, got their money back. There's a provision called the springing lien. I love the sound of that. You know, the good thing about TIFIA money is it's subordinated to all the other debt on the project. So you don't pay TIFIA until everything else has been paid. So that's best kind of money, right? But you don't want to be at the end of the line if the project defaults. You know, you want to be up there with the big boys to get some fraction of whatever liquidation of the project brings. And so the South Bay was the first time the springing lien provision had been tried, and it worked. You know, TIFIA got all their money out of that project. There may have been some foregone interest, you know, depending on how you look at it. But TIFIA claims that they were fully compensated in the South Bay example. But the private folks lost their shirts. And Pocahontas Parkway is a project in Virginia, downtown Richmond, which is the state capital, bisected by the James River, so it's a navigable waterway, although there's not much traffic on it. Coast Guard considers it a navigable waterway, and therefore the bridge had to be very high. So they built a very high, very expensive bridge to go across the James River to serve future real estate development on the other side of the river, which didn't materialize. Toll revenue didn't materialize. It was sold to Transurban, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, an Australian company that has been very active in Virginia, but they recently brought their interest in it down to zero, and they are transferring their interest in it to lenders. So another big loss. So I mentioned this before, you know, the movement to the availability payment model is a little bit more attractive now because the